So before we learn how to create Lambda functions using Golang, so we will create some simple programs using the core SDKs in Golang, so that you will understand how like different tools are being created using different programming languages. So the first few videos, I'll be using Golang, AWS SDKs to do simple programs like creating a VPC, creating an S3 bucket, how to list S3 buckets using Golang, and also how to upload files and create a simple Lambda functions, invoking a Lambda functions, and a few other examples. So by using the core SDKs in AWS using Golang, and you will understand to read the documentation and how to come up with simple tools which you can make it as complicated or sophisticated as you want to do whatever you're trying to do within AWS. And once we pass that stage, then going to Lambda functions, which will be much easier because we'll be using the same packages and modules to access different services within the Lambda functions. So in order to get started with this, you need to have an AWS account. In my case, I already have it set up here, and and um, and then also if you go to the console, when you do an AWS STS get caller identity, you should see something like this. So I have an account, and then the user profile, it's going to be using the admin, which means you have access to do anything within the AWS environment. So in order to get this profile, you need to do AWS configure, and then you need to and then once you press enter, you can walk through the steps to set the access key and secret key so that you can get there. So you can also use environment variables, and if you know how to do that using roles, you can also make use of environment variables instead of setting long-term credentials, which is not a good security practice. But I'm just doing it for simplicity in here. So once here, the other thing you need to do is you need to go back to the documentation, and then let me tell you how to get to the documentation. So we'll be using Golang as two different versions. So if you just search for AWS Golang SDK V2 API reference. So if you type something like that, you're going to hit this place, and then you will get to something like here, where you can look at the how different how different modules and packages and functions are called within Golang. Let's see if I can go back to the okay, this is the actual code. So if you are interested in seeing how the code is actually written, you can go here. But I'm trying to go to the actual reference link. Sometimes it's challenging to figure it out. So let me go to the second link here. Okay. So when you go in here, it says like we recommend you migrate to AWS SDK for Go V2, which is what we are looking for. So let's go there. So once you go there, you're going to see a lot of code examples, which is how I got some samples. But you can take a look at that. But I'm trying to go to the API reference, which is over here. So once you go there, you will see something called service, which will show you various services which you can access using Golang. So in our case, we've been looking at EC2. So let's go to EC2, which is a module. So module is something which has combinations of different packages within a module, right? Think of this as libraries in Python or other programming languages. So these are the different types that are available within the EC2. So in our program, we need to be importing this module in our code in order to get access to all these different types, which sometimes Visual Studio Code or which I'll be using nvim with all the tools loaded. So it'll automatically import most of these in a program. If not, you can include these things. And also so I'm not going to teach you step by step. I'm going to code along, and then we'll come and reference these documentation so you kind of understand how to read this. So the core thing is you have to play with this, or and find some examples, and then learn how to use this documentation. So once you understand how to use this documentation, and using a lot of these different methods and function and types becomes pretty simple to you, right? So let me close these things so that we don't get distracted. So I'm going to close these two. So I'm in the VPC, and I was playing with this. I'm going to delete this VPC as well. In your case, you will have the default VPC if you have a new account. So let's start to do some coding here. So I'm going to create a directory so that we can put all these SDK related examples in one place. I'm going to call it SDKs. So there's nothing there. And also we're going to create a module, meaning we will put a lot of related things in the same thing. So let's also do like go mod, go init mod, and then I'll call AW samples. You can name it anything you want. So it just creates a go.mod file, which if you look at it, there's nothing. It says it's using Golang 1.8 version. You may have a later version, but that's fine as long as you're more than 1.15. I think you should be good to go. So now I'm going to create a file called create vpc.go. So the first line in any Go programming language is package main, and so that's what we'll do. And you'll also be having a lot of imports in your program. So let's create the import structure as well. So as you start writing code, NVim or Visual Studio Code will start adding the imports automatically. If not, you can go add it yourself manually, but most of the time it helps us by doing that without you having to add it manually. So the next thing is the func main. It's the main function where everything happens. So let's have this structure. So in order to access the AWS environment using the SDKs, you will be using the same pattern, which I'm going to comment and explain here. But once you understand those, the 3-step or 4-step process, you use the same pattern for accessing any of the services within AWS. So the first step is you need to load the AWS SDK configurations. So that'll be the first step. And the second step is you need to create a service client. So this is examples are like VPC client or S3 client or Dynamo DB client. So you need something, a handle, so that you can call other methods and types and functions inside that, so that you can create whatever you're trying to do for your program. So the third step is you need to create input variables. So whenever you create a VPC, for one example, which you're going to see here, you need to pass in the CIDR block, which is what will be the IP range that is used by the VPC. And when you create an S3 bucket, you will need to tell what is the bucket name, right? And what kind of properties does it have to be encrypted and things like that. So there are many required parameters, and there are some optional parameters which we will look at the documentation to see how to figure that out, so that all those things would be set up in this input variables side. And the last step is you will be calling the actual uh, uh, function, so that to create the VPC or S3 bucket, which is like call the actual function to do stuff. I'm going to keep it generic like that. So let's follow this 4-step pattern for each of the code for the next 4 or 5 videos. So once you start following these examples and then play with your own environment, this will become second nature, and you'll be able to use this knowledge and create whatever you're trying to do, or build a tool, for example, and then release it to other people so they can use it. So let's start with the SDK configuration. So if you're not understanding line by line, that's okay, because most of the time, once you have one or two programs written, you will be copy pasting it, and then after a point, you will try to understand, wait a minute, what is this line actually doing it, and then you will try to Google that, and then you will be able to figure out what exactly it's doing. So all I'm saying is, just go with the flow, and then try to understand, and then get something working. And once you get excited about some functionality, then go dive deep into what the actual function is doing, and see if you can tweak one or two things and see what's happening. So that's the best way to learn. So instead of learning Golang step by step, looking at the different types, functions, loops, and then going to AWS, and then learning about simple functions one by one. So this kind of methodology or approach gives you learn Golang and also AWS SDKs in one step, and also once you spend some time, you'll get really good at it. So that's the way I learn typically. You just take some examples or goals or something you're trying to accomplish, and then use your search to get some examples and just start playing with it. So the more you play with it, the more comfortable you're going to get with it. So the first thing is the configuration. So what is the configuration is actually doing? So it is trying to get the credentials and also set some variables so that the program knows what it is trying to do. So the most important thing in the configuration is trying to find the credentials to log into the AWS environment. So in our case, we'll be using the AWS profile, which was set using AWS configure command. So you can also use environment variables to set the access keys, secret keys, session keys, and so this configuration, load configuration, which we're going to write right now, we'll able to read from it and access the AWS environment. So in order to do that, let's do a config CFG, and then we'll have an error variable. So if you're not familiar too much with Golang, this is how you would define two values, where the first one is a config, which will get the config um, response, and then the second one, if there's any errors, the error variable will have the error related information, so that you can output to the user so that they know what is going on. So the first thing is config. So we're going to use the config package or type within AWS SDKs to load the default config. So this is what is going to use the environment variables or AWS profile to access the AWS environment. So in this case, we're not going to change too much. So we're going to say context dot to do, which is in simple ways we're saying like we don't care about the context in this case. But in the future, if you're using any session and things like that, you can pass additional context, and then we'll look at it as we get to that stage. The second value is I'm just going to the next line here. The second one is you need to tell which region you want to operate in. By default, it might use US East 1, but I'm going to just specify it explicitly here so that you know how to use that too. So you can operate in any region. So I'm going to say region, and then I'm going to say US East 1. And you need to close one more parenthesis. So I think we're good there. So once you do this, you're setting up the variable so that you can operate with the CFG variable to pass into your service client later on. So one of the good practices is always check for errors. So you cannot always trust that your APIs, or whenever you call a function, it's going to work. So you're going to check for errors all the time. So you're going to say if it's not nil, which means there is an error, you have to log something. So let's use a package called log fatal. We'll be using log or FMT, one of the two, all the time. But there are subtle differences in the way you do log versus FMT, which again, don't worry about it at this time. Just do whichever is convenient at this time. So we're going to say unable to load SDK config. And then I'm going to use %v, which means you can use a %s for strings, but v is more flexible in the sense you can use any kind of types in here. So I'm going to say log in the error message. Okay, so we kind of loaded the config, we look for errors, And the second thing is to create a service client, which is this step right here. So we're going to say, we're going to create another variable, EC2 client, and then we're going to call EC2, and we're going to say create VPC. I'm sorry, we're going to call this service client. So whenever you have to create a client, you always call this function new from config and pass in the variable which we just created here. So if you're wondering how did I know how to create this new from config, um, so the best way is to look at the examples, right? I'm going to duplicate this. So if you search for new from config, so it says new from config returns a new client, right? The client can be any client, can be an EC2 client, S3 client, or DynamoDB. But it always, you have to call this function. And the way I know it, because I kind of played with Golang a lot in order to understand that. There's also a lot of code examples which you can get. And if you look at the function definition, the first parameter is using a CF, it's a config, which is what we created here, a config. And then the second one is optional. So if you want to pass in more additional variables to override something, you can pass this optional functions. But in this case, we're not going to worry about it at this time. And it says it returns a new client from the provided config. So you can also see that the return type, this is the return type within the function. It's a client, and it is returning a pointer, right? So now that is all it takes to create a client for, again, you should be checking, that's all it takes to create a client here. And the next step is to create an input variables. So what kind of values will you be passing to the create VPC function? So let's do a VPC input. And then we're going to be using a reference. And then we're going to say create VPC input. So there is a lot of variables you can pass to this function in order to know what to pass. So let's go back to the documentation and then say, so this is the first one here. So if you look here, these are the different values you can pass to this type. And if you look at the documentation, whenever it's a required field, you will say that is a required field. We'll see some examples of that in some other examples. But in this case, it doesn't look like anything is required. But you can, if you want to tweak the program which you're writing now, you can always just play with it for these different values here. So in this example, just to show you how to pass in a variable, I'm going to give in an IP4 range so that whenever the VPC is created, it uses that range instead of using the default ones. And so if you look at it, it's a string, and cider block is a string. So one of the weird things you do with Golang is it always accepts a reference, and so that it needs to be a pointer value, so that you cannot just pass in a static string. So you have to use a helper function so that it will give you the reference implementation of the string. So just follow what I'm doing here, and once you do a lot of examples, you can easily use the helper functions to understand exactly what's going on behind the scenes. So the only thing we're going to do is the cider block, which is the parameter. You should be very careful with the syntax. So if you're not comfortable, you can just copy paste it here. And then you assign it to AWS string. And then it's going to be the, I'm going to be using 10.0.0.1/16. Then we're going to close this parenthesis, and I think we need one more. So that's pretty much how you create the input. So now that we have an input, we need to pass into the function. So how do you do that? So you have a client, you have something input. So now you need to call a method inside this EC2 client in order to create the actual VPC. So let's do that. Create. So let's do VPC out, and then we'll have an error value as well. And then we'll call EC2 client, and then we're going to say create VPC. So this is the function you need to call to actually create a VPC. And if you're wondering how I knew that, it's the same, you just have to search for it. Create VPC. And then, so these are the different types, right? I mean, this is not, doesn't have any methods inside that. So if you're scrolling down, so you can see a create VPC, which is inside of the client package. So if I click on that, so you can see this is how the create functions looks like. So the first parameter is a context. In this case, we're going to be doing the same thing as we did for the initial configuration, that we're not going to be passing anything. So we'll use the default context or to do, which means that we're not passing any new context. And the second parameter is the input, which is what we created in step 3. And then the third one is an optional parameters, which we are not going to worry about it at this time. And as far as the output, when you call this function, the output is going to be two things, which is the create VPC output and then the error object. So if you go back here, so that's why we have to have this VPC out, which will get the create VPC output. And then the error variable will be assigned. If there's an error, it will be assigned to that. So let's go create the context to do. And then the second one is the VPC input. So since we already passed a reference here, this is already a pointer, so you can just pass in the VPC without any asterisks or anything like that here, or ampersand here. So if you don't know C, C++, this could be really this is complicated, but just follow this for a couple of exercises, and then once you get comfortable, it should be pretty straightforward. So let's see what it's complaining here. So it's a VPC input colon create VPC input CIDR block. Oh, we need to be using not this one. So we'll be using this phrases here. Okay. So now we are done with the input. Obviously, you need to check for the errors. Actually, let's go ahead and do that so that you don't forget. Error not equal to null. So you're going to say log.fatal. And you can say something like fail to create VPC. And I'm going to use %v like we did last time. And then we can do error. So now that we handle the error, and the last step is if it is all good so far, we need to output the VPC ID so that you can display to the user what the VPC ID is. So just to have a different flavor, I'm going to use a log format command and then do a printf. And you're just going to say VPC created, and then with a %s. And the value is going to be VPC out. So that's how you print the VPC. So if you're wondering like how I knew this, so you have to go back here, and then in the create VPC, I'm just going to open a new tab. Still loading. Now my internet is slow for some reason, I don't know why. So if you look here, so it has two member variables. One is of VPC and resulting metadata. And if you go one step further, so you need to go to the output, object, and VPC. And then, so if you look at here, VPC ID, that's exactly what I have it here. So VPC out, you need to go inside VPC, and then I'm accessing a variable inside that to print out the values. So I think we're pretty much done. So let's see, I'm going to write it out here and then go to another tab. And then let me clear out here. So where did we create? Okay, so there it is. So let's do go run create VPC. So it is saying like these packages are not downloaded. So remember, these are packages, which is where the actual code exists. So in order for your program to work, just like you do with any other program like Python or C++, you need to have those libraries in the path. So Go is an easy way to do that. Since we created a library, you can do a Go mod tidy. So it's going to try to find these modules from online in GitHub, and then it's going to download all the packages. So once you do that, you can try to do. So it says there's a typo, fatal F. So let's go back and check that. Okay, so it should be a capital F. So okay. So now let's see. Okay, now let's try one more time. If I can type today. Okay, so it's saying it's giving the address of the VPC ID, which is not what you're looking for. So let's do two things. Let's print the actual value of the VPC ID, and also let's do a new line so that this doesn't, it's not awkward like this. So if you go back to the code here, so in order to get the, so you need to have a pointer here. So this is a reference, right? And then in order to access the values, you need to dereference using an asterisk or a star value here. And also we thought, we discussed like we add a new line. So let's do that here. So now, so the VPC is already created. So that so in order to see the full thing, let's delete the VPC and then let's rerun the program. So go back here. Okay, this looks better. So the VPC ID is this, and then if you go back to the console here and refresh, so you're going to see the VPC ID, which is ending with 72E, 72E. So there you go. So we wrote a simple program where we used, with a few lines of code, we're able to create a VPC. So imagine you kind of learn how to access different AWS services using the SDK. You can create one complex program which does a lot of cool things, and it is just one binary which you can ship it to anyone, and whether it's a Windows machine or a Linux machine or a Mac OS, this program will work the same for everyone, because this one binary will have everything that is included to run this program in their environment. So the next example, we will use the same pattern and see how to create an S3 bucket using the same approach. So until then, see you all, and I hope you can spend some time to practice this on your in your environment.